Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and in the studio today I am joined in spirit by Chris and Jay. They have recently put out a couple of articles discussing the state of the game on Arena and the formats at large, and I think there's some things here worth covering and worth thinking about for our budget community. But hey, before we get into all that, I wanted to take just a moment to thank my community for helping the Stronghold reach a bit of a long-term goal here. 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. Definitely a tremendous thing. Thank you for all the views, all the subs, all the likes, all the comments, and just generally being a very supportive community. It means so much more than you'll ever know. And hey, what do you do when you reach a goal? You set a new one. So moving forward, my main talking point goal is going to be to reach just 50 followers over on Twitch. And frankly, we're already about halfway there, so this one should be really, really easy. If you're not already following me on Twitch, please consider doing so. And that always gives you kind of a sneak peek of some of the live play content, things like that. And of course, the support continues to help the community grow. And I'll be thinking up a giveaway to do once we get there. Probably not a whole account this time around, but hey, that's okay. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. I think one of the most noteworthy things that got said in both of these articles was by Chris, where he was discussing communications. And please allow me to quote slash paraphrase. While we've increased our communication, we still have some work to do on frequency, timing, and accuracy. Too often, content was published too late with inaccurate information or with links that didn't work. He went on to say, one of those improvements will be managing our feedback site better to ensure that player feedback isn't slipping through the cracks. In addition, we'll try and be more proactive in discussing why certain areas may not see the rate of improvement some players want. Both of those came from Chris's recent State of the Game, dated September 11th of this year. Being 2023, in case you're watching this much later. I think this is a very idealistic idea that he is doing about doing a better job of communicating with the community and getting correct information out there. I know as a content creator, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart because when they put out wrong information, then I'm putting out wrong information too. And nobody likes that. Nobody likes to find out that what they were told when push comes to shove isn't the reality, whether that's a midweek magic issue or simply just not being transparent in communications. This is one of those areas that I have harped on over the last 4 or 5 months in particular. About a year ago, we got a snapshot of different formats and how often they're played across a standard, historic, alchemy, and the then still very new explorer format. And we got about a year's worth of data. It showed the fluctuation, seasonalities, impacts of rotation, different sets that were being produced, etc., etc. And I was really beginning to wonder if they were ever going to release data like this again. And lo and behold, they did give us some data, although they stated that this was for an, and I quote, recent month, which I'm going to take based on that and some of the interplay that we're seeing with Standard and Alchemy, that this was a summer month. They also went on to say that this was non-event play, meaning it was made up of the ranked and play queues of both best of 1 and best of 3. And I'm more interested for the beginning of the month, particularly given the fact that this was a summer month. So I've eyeballed these to be about 41% standard, 25% historic, a newcomer 14% brawl, 13% alchemy, and 7% explorer. Jay then goes on to discuss each of the formats, starting with standard. and states that Standard obviously is the most popular format on Arena, has the largest share of games played by far, and it talks about the graph that we've been looking at as being prior to rotation, another indication that this might be a summer month. And he points out the fact that you see standard share going down a little bit while historic and other modes grow slightly, and points out that this is a bit of a cyclical pattern, but that standard pretty much always remains the clear leader. When it comes to historic, he mostly is emphasizing the fact that they're very happy with where historic is. But ironically, we see some pushback in various areas from players that talk about historic and the inclusion of digital first formats, alchemy impact cards, really, in some player opinion, distorting historic. And really, Jay does not seem to address that at all, kind of leaving that hanging for the dissatisfied portion of historic players. And since we've touched on alchemy, Jay pointed out that they have been happy with how alchemy has played out so far, which kind of resonates to Chris's similar statement last year. He goes on to say that the metagame has stayed open and diverse with a good amount of change, even week to week. I'm not quite sure how true that is. We feel like this is creating an interesting and engaging format, and play rates tend to back this up with both new and veteran playing shifting to that format. And I don't know, when I look at this line, I don't see a lot of shift to alchemy. And later we'll discuss the year-over-year shifts, but I'm not sure that I'm really seeing a shift in alchemy based on the data that they're giving, although there seems to be a case of them clearly trying to make that pattern appear based on the data that we're given. And part of the reason for this disparity is the inclusion of Brawl data this time around. In fact, Jay goes on to say the last time we talked about formats, we focused on discussing the 4 primary Arena formats, but that left players wondering where their favorite format, Brawl, fit in. In the last 12 months or so, Brawl has grown notably and now represents a decent chunk of our play. In particular, we are seeing more players who really focus on Brawl as opposed to treating it like a side dish. The play data above combines both normal and historic Brawl, but historic Brawl is the overwhelming bulk of the play that they see. This really kind of tends to warp this a little bit. We certainly see Brawl pretty consistent there. I'm guessing that dip about 1/3 way through the data is probably about the time the Lord of the Rings set came out, and a lot of people were playing Alchemy at that point and maybe shifting away from Brawl, historic Brawl temporarily. And when we compare last year's data versus this year's data release, we see a lot of similarities. Standard went from 53% to 41%. Historic went from 28 to 25. But like we were just talking about, Brawl was not included in last year's data. And since we're talking about percentages of play, adding in a new group can have some warping effects. If we were to back out this Brawl percentage and allow it to go back into the other formats by just simply backing it out of the analysis, I think we would see that standard and historic really didn't change much at all. We see here, even with the Brawl data, Explorer stayed a pretty consistent 7%. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a relatively expensive format. Alchemy, we do see rise by a whole 1 percentage point. If one allows themselves to presume that one of Arena's goals is to increase the play in Alchemy, this minor shift might go a long way to explaining why we have seen so much push towards Alchemy here at Rotation. Collections for new player experiences went from about 1/3 Alchemy all the way up to 39%. And the rares in the 2-color decks went from 0 Alchemy cards all the way up to 46% of the cards are now only playable in Alchemy. Similarly, we saw the renewal rare rewards for the renewal egg, if you would. 60% of those rewards were entirely Alchemy based. And in fact, I have a survey running right now to find out how the community feels about this push towards Alchemy and how it is affecting their play decisions, if at all. Personally, I'm not all that bothered by it. I will go wherever the community pushes me, but I really want to hear from all of you out there and see how this has affected your play. And that leaves Explorer as the last format to discuss. And they talk about their introduction last year. It was intended to kind of compel itself towards a competitive pioneer. They do go on to say that they think they will be achieving that competitive pioneer level by late 2024, or for the first time discussing an early 2025 date for the release of Pioneer Masters. We know that this is a longer timeline than Explorer players wanted, but as the graph above shows, our players are spread across a variety of formats, and we need to balance our work across this. I think they have backpedaled a little bit here, and I think there's a bit of justification talking about how many different formats there are, and well, frankly, they're kind of pointing out that not enough people play Explorer for them to put a lot of resources into it. And hopefully that's something that changes. I do think the major thing that's holding Explorer back is that it's very hard to break into for newer players. It can be kind of expensive because there's no way of gathering the cards for free, essentially, the way you can in Standard. So hopefully this is something we can combat as a community over time. And of course, all of this spurred some conversation regarding Modern and the possibility of this coming to Arena. Jay talked about upcoming editions like Modern Horizons 3 having a big impact on Historic, bringing a bunch of powerful new cards. And if you recall earlier, they talked about Historic being in a good place and them liking that. We like the fundamental power space that Historic is occupying. However, we don't want to shift that by a huge leap. So we will continue to manage what cards enter the format. They did pre-bans for Enchanting Tales, and they mostly want to ensure that Historic stays balanced, diverse, and a fun for a wide range of players. This tells me they know they're bringing more cards to Arena that are not really intended for Horizons, or excuse me, for Historic, which tells me they're meant for something. Chris goes on to say that when they launched Arena, the open beta 5 years ago, it's actually been 6 years if you were part of the closed beta, that at that time they had just Standard, and now they've added Historic and a bunch of other things, and things have been moving at a really fast pace, and we can't really expect that sort of fast-paced growth to continue, that things are going to slow down a little bit. He goes on to say, while we have seen player interest in Modern on MTG Arena, especially after our recent announcements at Gen Con regarding Modern Horizons 3, this isn't something we currently have in our plans. There's simply too large of a content gap there for us to close anytime soon. And this has spurred a huge amount of conversation on the internet about Modern being dead for Arena, that it's not coming. But I see it a little differently. Frankly, I think those people are dead wrong. I don't think anyone realistically ever thought they were going to be flipping a switch to give us 100% of Modern anytime soon. I think at best we're going to see something like a Modern-esque format in much the same way that Explorer led to Pioneer. And don't get me wrong, I don't think they're hiding anything. I think we can take them at their word. When Chris says that this isn't in their plans, I think that is probably true, but we know for Arena and the Alchemy development and things like that, the time frame for development is much smaller than for the Premier, i.e. standard sets. Those have multi-year windows. In fact, recently we saw previews as far out as 2026. It seems like Arena is operating more on a 1-year-esque window. And since this is likely to come out no sooner than maybe mid 2025, I believe Chris when he says that this isn't really in their plans yet. Although I think the groundwork has been laid for that to become part of the plan. Chris is very fond of saying in interviews, we don't have anything to announce yet. There's nothing to announce right now, et cetera, et cetera. But I think they are obviously keeping their options open. They just don't want to overcommit to something that maybe is more complicated than they expected. They had already, just within the last couple months, committed to a competitive level Pioneer clone in the form of Explorer on Arena by the end of 2024. And we have seen that they're already having to backpedal that back maybe as much as 6 months by pushing it into, and I quote, early 2025. So I still say Modern is coming, and I think it is a wise decision to keep that in mind as you do things like your draft choices for the Enchanting Tales and other Premier sets as they come out over time. And I'd like to close today's discussion with some comments that were made by Chris in his article regarding the future. We've seen good examples over the past couple of summers where the summer creates a hole in the schedule where those who aren't interested in limited formats for that summer or Alchemy in general, we see it again next summer with the release of Modern Horizons 3. While we may not have something for everyone every single week, we do want to minimize the time when folks are less excited to log in. We don't have specific plans yet to share, but we are aware of the opportunity to engage more players. In addition, we've heard some feedback on various releases, and we will continue to iterate and try and make releases as exciting as we can for players. Again, no plans to share, but we are likely an opportunity to have a release that has a narrow focus on the players it appeals to as a way to experiment and see how players react. I think this lends itself very well to what we were just talking about in Modern, where a smaller release like Modern Horizons 1 is very likely to be coming down the road once they start releasing a Modern-esque format to Arena. That was exactly what we saw with the release of Pioneer, where they did Explore Horizons 1, I think is what they called it. So I think all the groundwork is there. I think it's also interesting that Chris seems to be thinking about scheduling in week blocks as opposed to set blocks. He made a specific comment. We may not have something for everyone every single week, but we want to minimize the time when folks are less excited to log in. So I think that's an interesting tidbit, and that is definitely going to shape and influence my thinking about Arena moving forward. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank all of my patrons and remind the community when we hit just 10 patrons at any level, we will be rolling out Discord for the entire community, not just paid patrons. So if you have the means or mind to do so, consider supporting our community as it continues to grow. And of course, supporting the community by liking, commenting, subscribing, or sharing our videos is always appreciated.